Catherine, his wife, was devoted, graceful, and fiercely loyal. She believed in love as a partnership, in honesty, in the unspoken bonds that hold a family together. But Richard had grown impatient with her gentleness. In his mind, it wasn't enough that she loved him, he wanted her out of the way entirely. And then there was Vanessa, the mistress whose beauty and ambition had entranced him like a moth to flame. She whispered promises of freedom, adventure, and a life unburdened by morality, and Richard listened. One rainy evening, when the storm outside seemed to echo the chaos inside the mansion, Richard enacted his plan. It wasn't just betrayal this time, it was cruelty. Catherine's once vibrant life was reduced to a silent nightmare as Richard, under the guise of a simple accident, left her broken and wheelchair-bound. He told himself it was temporary, that she would forgive him eventually, but deep down, he didn't care. All that mattered was Vanessa's approving smile. The mansion that had once resonated with laughter now echoed with Catherine's muted despair. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out in anger. Instead, she watched. She observed every detail of Richard's increasingly reckless affair, every whisper of guilt that he tried and failed to hide. And slowly, Catherine began to plan, not for revenge born of hate, but for justice calculated with icy precision. Vanessa, intoxicated by the illusion of power, didn't notice the subtle changes in the household. A misplaced item here, a late-night visitor there, a shadow that seemed to linger a moment too long, all unnoticed, all orchestrated by Catherine. She was learning, adapting, turning her pain into an invisible weapon that Richard would never suspect. Then came the night of the gala, the kind of high-society affair where secrets are buried under champagne and chandeliers. Richard, smug and confident, paraded Vanessa before the city's elite, flaunting the illusion of a perfect new life. But Catherine had sent her silent message, one that would unfold in ways Richard could never predict. The night glimmered with gold and crystal, the chandeliers casting fractured reflections across the polished marble floors. Catherine watched from the shadowed balcony of the mansion's grand hall, her wheelchair positioned so that no one could see the intensity in her gaze. The music played like a mockery, light, airy strings that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in her mind. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, imagining how she would turn Richard's arrogance into his undoing, and how Vanessa's false sense of triumph would crumble before the truth. Richard was in his element, the life of the party, laughing with businessmen, nodding at politicians, swirling his drink with the careless air of a man who believed he controlled everything. Vanessa, radiant in a sapphire gown that hugged her like a second skin, leaned into him, her eyes glittering with satisfaction. She thought she had won everything, a wealthy husband, a life of luxury, and the silence of Catherine, who was now supposedly a permanent obstacle, yet harmless, broken, irrelevant. What neither of them realized was that Catherine had spent months building her quiet revenge. She had allies, hidden away in the staff who had watched Richard's cruelty for years and resented it in silence. There were cameras installed under the guise of security, discreet, nearly invisible, that recorded every whispered conversation, every glance that revealed Richard's duplicity. Catherine's intellect, once underestimated, had become her weapon. She had learned to move without being noticed, to make her presence felt without revealing herself, and tonight, all of it would converge. As the evening wore on, Catherine's first act unfolded with subtlety. A small envelope, sealed with wax, was slipped into Vanessa's purse while she danced in the arms of a distracted socialite. Inside were photographs, pictures of Richard and another woman, not Vanessa, taken during secret meetings in far-flung locations. The evidence was damning, each photo meticulously labeled with dates and locations. Vanessa, oblivious at first, would not notice until later. But by then, her world would begin to fracture. Meanwhile, Catherine's attention shifted to Richard himself. She had prepared something even more personal, a confrontation that would leave him shaken beyond measure. The grand hall seemed to narrow in her eyes as she studied him from above, each gesture of his arrogance fueling the careful anger that had grown within her. She remembered the way he had looked down at her after the accident, the coldness in his eyes, the satisfaction in his smile. That smile would not survive tonight. She instructed one of the loyal staff, a man named Marcus, to subtly alter the lighting in the hall and to ensure that certain guests were guided to Richard's private office under the pretense of a last-minute business matter. The office itself was prepared meticulously, documents, letters, and recorded confessions strategically placed so that when Richard entered, he would be trapped in a room of his own lies, each piece of evidence pointing back to him. Marcus moved with silent efficiency, knowing that tonight, for the first time, the mansion belonged to Catherine. Back on the balcony, Catherine felt the familiar sting of physical limitation, the frustration of immobility. Yet in her mind, she was limitless. She envisioned Richard alone in that office, discovering the web she had spun. The thought made her pulse quicken. And then, a new development, Vanessa, curious and suspicious, drifted away from the crowd, drawn to her purse. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope. Her eyes widened as she scanned the photographs, the color draining from her face. She looked around frantically, realizing that Richard had betrayed her in ways she had never imagined. Panic flared, and for the first time that night, the mistress felt fear. Richard, oblivious to Vanessa's discovery, was summoned to the office by a message he assumed was routine. His pride gave him confidence, a dangerous confidence, and he strode toward what he thought was a minor disruption. The office door clicked shut behind him, and the lights, altered as per Catherine's instructions, illuminated every incriminating document. His first glance was confusion, then disbelief, then terror. Every secret he had assumed was buried, every lie he had spun for months, was now laid bare before him. Catherine watched from her vantage point as his composure fractured. The man who had crippled her, who had tried to erase her existence, now looked small, vulnerable, human. And yet, she did not move to gloat, her satisfaction was a quiet, simmering force, like lava beneath a calm surface. She had waited for this moment, and it was more beautiful than she had imagined. Vanessa, her illusions shattered, fled into the night, the envelope clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Her betrayal of Catherine, though indirect, had led her into a trap of her own making. Catherine's mind raced ahead, the two of them would collide, and when they did, Richard's downfall would accelerate. The mistress who thought she controlled everything was now powerless, a pawn caught in the very game she had tried to manipulate. Back in the office, Richard's panic grew. He tried to destroy the evidence, frantically shoving papers into drawers, but Catherine had anticipated this. The doors locked automatically, a silent safeguard ensuring that he could not escape the consequences of his actions. He banged on the door, screamed, cursed, but no one came. He was trapped, a man undone by his own arrogance. From the balcony, Catherine allowed herself a small smile. The plan was working, yet the final act had not begun. She had one more card to play, something that would ensure Richard could never hurt her or anyone else again. It required patience, timing, and a psychological precision she had cultivated during her darkest days. The audience, those invisible observers she had imagined through the months, would witness a reckoning that was not merely physical, but moral, emotional, and inevitable. And then, a sudden movement, the flash of headlights outside the grand hall, signaling the arrival of a visitor she had orchestrated weeks before. The car door opened, and a figure stepped into the rain, the water dripping from the hem of an expensive coat, the expression unreadable. Catherine knew this arrival would change everything. The person carried the leverage, the proof, and the confrontation that Richard could never anticipate. Richard, inside the office, had no idea that the threads of his life were unraveling not just from the documents in front of him, but from forces he had ignored, underestimated, and scorned. Catherine, in her wheelchair, looked down at the hall with an unshakable calm. She had suffered, she had endured, and now she was no longer a victim. She was the architect of a justice so meticulous, so complete, that even Richard's wealth, power, and arrogance could not shield him. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the mansion like the heartbeat of fate itself. Catherine's mind was alive with the possibilities, each one more satisfying than the last. The storm mirrored the chaos she had lived through, yet within her, there was clarity, purpose, and an unyielding sense of triumph. And just as the clock neared midnight, a sound echoed through the mansion, a door creaking open, footsteps descending the grand staircase. The visitor had arrived, and with them came the culmination of months of patience, strategy, and unrelenting resolve. Catherine's eyes glinted with anticipation, her lips curving into a smile that promised not vengeance alone, but revelation, exposure, and the final humiliation of the man who had believed he could break her. The footsteps grew louder, the visitor's presence undeniable, yet Richard remained oblivious to the storm about to engulf him. Every element of Catherine's plan converged in this single moment. Outside, the lightning split the sky, illuminating the grandeur of the mansion while casting shadows across the hall where power, betrayal, and justice would collide. Catherine's heart raced, not with fear, but with the quiet, controlled thrill of inevitability. She had suffered the unimaginable, yet tonight, she would witness the unraveling of a man who had underestimated the very person he had sought to destroy. The pieces were in place, the stage set, and the actors unaware of the script written for them. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the grand hall, and the visitor finally came into view. Tall, imposing, and calm, the figure moved with a precision that suggested both authority and purpose. Richard, still trapped in his panic, didn't recognize the weight of the presence before him until a voice rang out, a voice he had long ignored, a voice that now cut through the panic like a blade. "Richard Calloway," the figure said, slow and deliberate, "your games end tonight." Catherine watched from her balcony, a subtle smile curling on her lips. The final act was beginning, and the magnitude of what would unfold was more exquisite than she had imagined. Her wheelchair seemed to glide with a force beyond its mechanical constraints, as if her very will had imbued it with strength. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside the mansion, violent, relentless, unstoppable. Richard's face twisted from arrogance to disbelief. He had expected threats, perhaps confrontation, but not this. The visitor stepped closer, holding a briefcase that seemed ordinary enough, yet carried the weight of revelation. With a single motion, the contents were revealed, documents, recordings, and evidence that Richard had thought long buried, carefully concealed, and irrevocable in its secrecy. Every misdeed, every betrayal, every act of cruelty toward Catherine, the staff, and even Vanessa, was laid bare in exquisite detail. Richard tried to protest, to speak, to manipulate the narrative as he always had, but the room seemed to close around him. The walls, lined with evidence, were witnesses in their own right. No words could erase the truth. No charm, no wealth, no whispered apologies could undo the years of calculated betrayal. The visitor's eyes bore into him, unflinching, leaving him exposed in a way Catherine had never been exposed, raw, vulnerable, powerless. Vanessa, still reeling from the photographs Catherine had planted in her purse, stumbled into the hall, her face pale, her composure shattered. She had been Richard's partner in deception, yet she too had become a pawn in a game she didn't even realize existed. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been a mistress to cruelty itself, blind to the consequences. Catherine, now moving with deliberate grace toward the center of the hall, felt the culmination of her patience, her suffering, and her intelligence converge. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and discarded, yet tonight, she held power that no one, not Richard, not Vanessa, not anyone, could challenge. She stopped at the base of the grand staircase, and for the first time, Richard looked at her not as a victim, but as a sovereign force. "You thought you could destroy me," Catherine said, her voice calm but commanding, echoing through the cavernous hall. "You thought my loyalty, my love, my strength, would make me weak. But weakness is not in surviving, it is in underestimating those you think you control." Richard staggered backward, his arrogance replaced by a raw, instinctive fear. The grandeur he had built, the life he had flaunted, the power he had wielded, none of it could shield him from the consequences now crashing upon him. Each revelation, each proof of betrayal, each lie laid bare, was a hammer striking at the foundation of his world. Vanessa's gaze fell to the floor as she understood the truth. She had been deceived, manipulated, and abandoned by the man she had coveted. The envy and greed that had driven her to align with Richard now consumed her with guilt and fear. Catherine's plan had not merely destroyed Richard, it had dismantled the illusion of control they both had clung to. Catherine wheeled forward, closer to the office door where Richard had tried in vain to hide. The locked room, now open, stood as a monument to his failure. The documents, the recordings, the irrefutable proof of every cruel act were there, visible to all who entered. Richard's attempts at denial fell apart with each step she took, each calculated glance, each quiet assertion of her triumph. "Look around you," Catherine continued, her voice steady and unwavering. "This is your empire, Richard. Built on deception, cruelty, and the illusion of power. And now, it's nothing. Every lie, every betrayal, every act of violence you thought you could escape, is here for the world to see." Richard sank to the floor, his knees hitting the marble with a hollow echo that reverberated through the hall. The power he had wielded for so long, the control he had believed was absolute, dissolved in an instant. He was no longer the charming, untouchable figure he had been, he was exposed, diminished, and utterly powerless. Outside, the storm raged as if celebrating the reckoning. Lightning illuminated the hall, and the sound of thunder rolled through the mansion, each boom punctuating the finality of Richard's defeat. Catherine felt a surge of liberation, not from vengeance, but from justice. She had endured unimaginable suffering, and now, she had orchestrated a conclusion that was as magnificent as it was inevitable. Vanessa, humbled and trembling, finally met Catherine's gaze. There was no anger, no malice, only recognition. She had been part of a system of cruelty, yet she now understood the magnitude of what had occurred. Catherine's presence radiated a power that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a reminder that those who survive injustice with patience and intelligence hold the ultimate strength. The authorities, summoned discreetly by Catherine in advance, arrived at the mansion just as Richard attempted to flee. The evidence was irrefutable, the witnesses prepared, and the trap perfectly set. He was arrested quietly, the grandeur of his life reduced to handcuffs and a police escort. The man who had crippled his wife for his mistress, who had believed he could manipulate everyone around him, was now merely a cautionary tale. Catherine watched as Richard was led away, a calm certainty settling over her. She had survived. She had reclaimed her power, her dignity, and her life. The mansion, once a gilded cage, now felt like a fortress of her triumph. The storm outside began to subside, the rain easing to a gentle drizzle, as if the world itself acknowledged the justice that had been served. And yet, the true beauty of Catherine's victory was in its subtlety. She had not merely destroyed Richard, she had exposed him, revealed the true cost of betrayal, and demonstrated that patience, intelligence, and resilience could overcome even the deepest wounds. Her suffering had been profound, but it had forged a strength that now radiated from her very being. Vanessa, forever altered by the events of the night, slipped quietly from the mansion, a humbling lesson etched into her soul. Catherine remained, alone but unbroken, basking in the stillness that followed the storm. She wheeled to the balcony, overlooking the city lights shimmering in the aftermath of the rain, and for the first time in years, she felt free. Truly free. Her voice, calm yet resolute, carried across the empty halls. Never underestimate the strength of someone who has nothing left to lose. Power is fleeting, but truth endures. The mansion, the witness to so many hidden cruelties, now stood as a testament to resilience, justice, and the quiet, unstoppable force of a woman who had been wronged but refused to remain a victim. The night air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of rain-washed freedom, as Catherine embraced the enormity of her victory. She had survived, triumphed, and ensured that those who thought themselves untouchable would never forget the lesson: cruelty can wound, but intelligence, patience, and moral clarity can destroy even the mightiest tyrant. Catherine wheeled herself slowly through the grand hall, her eyes taking in the beauty of the chandeliers, the polished marble, the reflection of the storm clouds above. She had endured, she had suffered, and she had conquered. And as the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, spilling gold into the mansion, she felt a profound sense of completion, a life reclaimed, a spirit unbroken, and a story that would be remembered not for the cruelty endured, but for the magnificent triumph of a woman who refused to be defeated. The mansion, once a symbol of her captivity, now symbolized victory. The storm had passed, the villain had been unmasked, and Catherine, resilient, brilliant, and unyielding, was finally free to live the life she had been denied for so long. And in the quiet that followed, one thing was unmistakably clear: no power, no wealth, no betrayal could ever break the woman who had mastered the art of patience, intelligence, and indomitable strength.